Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a really interesting dinosaur, Kuru Kulla.
Yeah, it's a relatively recent description, actually. We've got the scientific papers right here,
Hmm.
and they paint a fascinating picture. It even has this evocative name, Kuru.
Right, from the Tibetan Buddhist deity Kuru Kulla. That definitely catches your attention.
It does, but scientifically, what we're talking about is a small dromaeosaurid theropod.
Okay, so think small, fast meat eater related to things like velociraptor.
Exactly. And this one comes from the Late Cretaceous Barun-Goyot Formation in Mongolia, a really important spot for fossils.
And finding Kuru there, it sort of adds another layer to what we know about that specific time and place, doesn't it? That whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. Each find like this, especially from well-documented sources like the description we're looking at, it helps piece together that ancient world.
So our mission, as always, is to dive into these sources, the description, the related research, and really unpack Kuru, how it was found, what the name's about, what it actually looked like, and the world it lived in.
Sounds good. Let's get started.
Okay, so the discovery. Where does the story begin?
It goes back to July 5th, 1991. An American Mongolian expedition was working at a place called Kulsan, right in the Gobi Desert.
Wow, 91. So the bones have been around for a while.
They have. And what's pretty amazing is that Shri, which turned out to be a very closely related dinosaur, was found basically at the same time, hours later, same spot.
No way. That's incredible. It really makes you think about how they might have interacted living side by side like that.
It does. So the specific specimen that defines Kuru Kulla, the holotype, it has the number IGM 100981.
And that's kept safe in Mongolia now?
Yep, at the Institute of Geology, Mongolian Academy of Sciences
Uh-huh.
in Ulaanbaatar.
So what did they actually find? What bones make up this holotype?
Well, it's fragmentary, but there's a decent amount. Bits of the skull, like the front of the upper jaw, the premaxilla, and part of the lacrimal bone near the eye.
Okay.
Then part of the lower jaw, the dentary and the syringular, plus quite a few vertebrae 14 from the neck and back, 3 from the tail. And then fragments from the arms, a piece of the hip, the ends of the pubic bones, both thigh bones, the femora, a right tibia or shin bone, and bits and pieces from both feet.
So enough to get a good idea, but not a complete picture. And I think I read the preservation wasn't perfect.
That's right. Our sources say the preservation was, well, inconsistent and generally not as good as the Shri specimen found nearby. So that always adds a bit of a challenge, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Now, before it was Kuru, there was this other name floating around, Aracoraptor. What was that about?
Yeah, that's a bit of paleontological trivia.
Yeah.
Aracoraptor popped up in a bibliography, a list of references in a paper about a kilobator, actually, by Pearl and colleagues.
Just in a list, not in the main text.
Exactly. I mentioned a title like Morphology of a Dromaeosaurian Dinosaur Aracoraptor, but no actual paper with that title or describing Aracoraptor seems to exist.
Huh. So maybe a planned paper that never happened.
That's the thinking. Or maybe an abstract from a conference. Because it was never formally described, it's considered a nomen nudum.
A naked name, meaning it's not valid scientifically.
Precisely. No description, no official status.
And the name itself, Aracoraptor, there was some speculation it meant Kumi's thief.
Yeah, Napoli and his team suggested that possible meaning Arag or kumis being that fermented milk drink. Kind of a fun regional connection, but ultimately irrelevant since the name didn't stick.
Okay, and just to be crystal clear, the name Kuru has absolutely nothing to do with the disease.
Absolutely nothing. The authors were very explicit about that. It's purely named after the deity Kuru Kulla. Important clarification.
Got it. So, after the discovery in 91, things were quiet for a bit, but then parts of it surfaced in other research.
Sort of. In 2006, the syringular bone part of the lower jaw was described, but it was in the paper that actually named Sagan, another dromaeosaur.
Okay.
And then later that same year, things got a bit confused. That same syringular bone got mistakenly linked to a different specimen, IGM 103503, the Zoswash specimen.
And that wasn't Kuru.
No, that Zoswash specimen was later identified as belonging to Velociraptor. So for a while, the identity of the Kuru material was a bit muddled.
Man, it really took some untangling then.
It did. The official naming and the full, proper description didn't happen until 2021 by James Napoli and his colleagues. So 30 years from discovery to formal introduction.
Wow. Okay, so let's move on to what Kuru Kulla actually looked like. We know it's a small eudromaeosaur, similar in size to Velociraptor. What does eudromaeosaur imply exactly?
Right, so eudromaeosaur basically means it's part of the more advanced or derived group within the dromaeosaur family.
Yeah.
Things often associated with them are features like Um, a tail stiffened with long rods, probably for balance and agility.
Okay. And while Kuru shares that general body plan with Velociraptor and Sagan, the sources say it had unique features too. Autapomorphies.
Yes, exactly. Those are the distinctive traits that set it apart. Even with the fragmentary material, they identified several things unique just to Kuru.
Cool. Let's break some of those down. Starting with the skull fragments, the premaxilla and lacrimal. What did they show?
Okay, so the premaxilla, the very front of the upper snout. Based on the bit they have, they figure it likely had 4 teeth in that bone, which is pretty standard, though only 2 sockets are preserved.
And the lacrimal, the bone in front of the eye, you mentioned a groove.
Yeah, a really deep groove right in front of the nostril opening. It's deeper, more pronounced than in similar dinosaurs like Sagan or Linoraptor. The lacrimal itself was probably T-shaped, and it had this kind of shelf where it connected with the nasal bone above it.
And then there was that hornlet. That sounds pretty distinctive.
It does. On the upper back part of the lacrimal near the eye socket, there's this little bump like a small horn. It serves as rough, or rugose. Again, maybe a bit more developed than in other related species.
Interesting. Any idea what that was for? Display, maybe?
Hard to say for sure. Display is definitely a possibility. And also, on the underside of that lacrimal bone, there's a deep pit, which they interpret as the canal for the nasolacrimal duct, the tear ducts, basically.
Okay, moving down to the lower jaw, they found the dentary and syringular bones.
Almost complete left dentary, yeah, and the syringular, though in pieces. And the dentary is interesting because it's quite straight.
Straight. How's that different?
Well, many velociraptorines, like Velociraptor itself, have a noticeably curved or bowed lower jaw. Kuru's is straight, which is actually more like what you see in Dromaeosaurus or Deinonychus.
Huh. And it had a lot of teeth.
Seems like it. Potentially 14 or even 15 tooth positions in the dentary. Most related dinosaurs have maybe 11 or 12. So in that respect, it's a bit more like Sahelanthropus.
And the teeth themselves. Anything special?
They were xiphidont, so flattened side to side, blade-like, serrated front and back. Good for slicing. They had deep roots, but apparently lacked those vertical enamel ridges some other dromaeosaurs have.
And one was particularly fang-like.
Yeah, the third tooth in the dentary was quite elongated, described as a fang. And the socket for the fourth tooth is just as big, suggesting maybe it was also quite large when fully erupted.
Okay, and the syringular bone at the back of the jaw, that had something unique too.
2 holes, 2 foramina instead of the usual one.
2. Is that common?
Well, the sources say it's uncertain how common it is in this group because that bone isn't always well preserved. They note it might also be present in a dinosaur called Bagratinan, but Bagratin's classification is a bit debated.
Okay.
Also a shelf on the syringular angles upwards, dorsally, which is again similar to Deinonychus but different from any others where it angles outwards.
Got it. What about the backbone, the vertebrae?
They found a good number 4 from the neck, 10 from the back, 3 from the tail. Not articulated, so the exact positions are inferred by comparing them to Sagan and Shri. One observation is that the centra, the main body of the vertebrae, seem to get shorter as you go from the front of the back towards the tail.
And the arms. Any clues about feathers or function there?
We have bits of the humerus, upper arm, radius and ulna, lower arm, some wrist and hand bones, and a couple of claws. There are rough patches on the humerus, likely muscle attachments.
Any quill knobs? Those bumps for anchoring feathers?
Apparently not obvious, no. But that could just be preservation. It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
There is a ridge on the ulna, below the coronoid process, that's also seen in the unusual Romanian dinosaur Balar.
Oh, interesting.
And the radius has that flattened lower end, which is typical for this broader group, the Pentaraptorans. The hand itself, though, didn't show any really unique features that stood out.
Okay. And lastly, the hind limbs. Similar to Velociraptor and Shri here.
Yeah, quite similar in many respects. They found bits of the hip, both femora, part of a tibia, some foot bones including metatarsals and an ankle bone, plus toe bones and claws.
Right.
Like Velociraptor and Shri, Kuru has this noticeable ridge on the outside of the femur.
And the fourth trochanter, that muscle attachment point.
It seems to be absent, actually, though there's a ridge sort of where it should be, which might have served a similar function.
Now, the paper suggested some differences in body proportions, maybe a more robust skull, longer limbs.
Yeah, based on what they have, they hypothesize it might have had a relatively stockier skull, maybe proportionally longer limbs, and importantly, a possibly reduced killing claw on the second toe.
Reduced killing claw. For a dromaeosaur, that's really unexpected.
It is. It's one of the key features potentially linking it to Adasaurus, which also has a less developed claw compared to, say, Velociraptor or Deinonychus.
Does that suggest anything about how it lived or hunted?
Well, the researchers proposed it might hint at slightly different ecological habits, maybe different prey focus or hunting style, but they stress no one's done a detailed functional analysis yet, so that's still speculative.
Okay, so a unique mix of features. Now let's talk classification. Where does Kuru fit in the family tree? What did the original analysis by Napoli and colleagues find?
Their analysis, published with the description in 2021, placed Kuru as the sister taxon, the closest relative to Adasaurus.
Adasaurus, right, from the slightly younger Nemegt formation. What linked them together in that study?
They highlighted a few things. That posterior sharangular foramen, taking up about 30% of the bone's depth, the apparent lack of that fourth trochanter on the femur, the back vertebrae being longer than wide, and that potentially reduced killing claw, which Adasaurus also shows.
Did their analysis have any controversial findings?
Well, their placement of Balawar, the Romanian one within Velociraptorinae, was noted, as it mirrored an earlier study by Broussard, but differs from some other hypotheses that place Balawar elsewhere, maybe closer to birds.
Okay.
The results for Rheonavis and the Anchunithids were more, let's say, conventional for the time, but they did caution that the statistical support, the confidence level for some parts of their tree was low, so definitely room for more research.
And then Wang and colleagues did another analysis in 2022.
They did. They also found Kuru and Adasaurus grouped together, so that part was consistent. But they found this pair was actually closer to Saurnitholestes than to Svagan, or Velociraptor. So a slightly different neighborhood in the family tree.
Interesting. Did they differ on anything else?
Yeah, their analysis placed Rheonavis and the Anchiornithids firmly within Aviale as true early birds or very close relatives, which aligns with a lot of current thinking.
And then there was a more recent one by Czapieski.
Right, Łukasz Czapieski's work, mainly focused on Shri, also involved running phylogenetic analyses. His results generally agreed with Napoli et al., and another analysis by Powers et al. But one interesting outcome when he reran the Powers analysis was that Adasaurus popped out from the main group of Dromaeosaurians, Velociraptorines, and Saurnitholestines.
So that would place Adasaurus, and by extension potentially Kuru, in a slightly different spot again.
Exactly. It just highlights that the precise relationships, especially among these closely related Mongolian dromaeosaurs, are still being worked out. It's a dynamic field.
Absolutely. New data, new methods, the picture keeps refining itself. Okay, let's shift to paleoecology. What can we say about Kuru's diet and the world it lived in?
The diet specifically. Not much study yet. But the key thing is that Kuru wasn't alone. In the Barungoyot Formation, we have evidence for Kuru, Shri, and potentially another unnamed dromaeosaur, maybe like Velociraptor.
3 similar-sized predators in one place. How does that work?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It strongly suggests some form of niche partitioning. Maybe they hunted slightly different prey or hunted in different areas or different times. The subtle differences in skull shape between Kuru and Shri, for instance, might hint at dietary differences, but like we said, the Kuru skull material is very incomplete.
So a complex food web likely. What about the environment itself, the Barun-Goyot Formation?
It's interpreted as a pretty dynamic place. The locality, Kulsan, is near the Nemegt Formation geographically. The sediments suggest a mix of environments, sand dunes, interdune areas with temporary lakes, and also these sort of flat, muddy plains called takirs that flooded sometimes.
So not a lush jungle, more like semi-arid.
Yeah, relatively arid to semi-arid seems to be the consensus. Think wind-blown sand dunes, alluvial plains fed by occasional rivers, temporary lakes, lots of reddish sediments, sandstones with large-scale cross-bedding from the dunes. It's similar in some ways to the older Juducta Formation, famous for preserving things like Velociraptor and Protoceratops in dune collapses.
Okay. And who else was living there alongside Kuru?
Oh, quite a crowd. Various lizards like Gobiderma and Astesia, a surprising diversity of early mammals, multituberculates like Cetops batar, early marsupial relatives like Deltatheridium, early placentals like Asiarites.
Wow. And other dinosaurs?
Definitely. Armored ankylosaurs were common, Seichania, Tarchia, Zarapelta, a sauropod, Quasidosaurus. Then you have the marginocephalians, the Pachycephalosaur, Tylocephal, and the small ceratopsian Bagaceratops, which was apparently super abundant.
And Kuru's relatives, the Maniraptorans.
Loads of them. At least 4 types of alvarsaurs, those little insect eaters with the weird hands. Several oviraptorosaurs like Nemegtomia. And then the other dromaeosaurs we mentioned, Shri, that unnamed one, maybe even the possibly semi-aquatic Natovinator, plus early birds like Hollanda and Gobicteryx and lots of fossil eggs. It was a bustling place.
It really sounds like it, a complex ecosystem. So wrapping things up, what are the big takeaways on Kuru Kulla?
Well, it's a small velociraptor-sized dromaeosaur from late Cretaceous Mongolia. It has a unique set of anatomical features, especially in the skull, and maybe a reduced killing claw, setting it apart. Its discovery adds to the known diversity of small predators in the Barun-Goyot Formation.
And its relationship seems closest to Atosaurus, though the exact placement in the family tree is still under investigation.
Right, and it lived in this semi-arid, dune-filled environment alongside a really diverse fauna, including many other small theropods.
Which leads to that fascinating question you raised earlier.
Exactly. Having Kuru, Shri, and maybe another velociraptor-like form all running around the same place, it forces us to think about how they coexisted. How did they partition resources? What were those intricate predator-prey dynamics really like? It shows just how complex these ancient ecosystems could be.
A great point to ponder. It highlights how much more there is still to uncover about these lost worlds. Thanks so much for walking us through Kuru Kulla.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to explore these discoveries.